Welcome to another show where we focus on matters Africa. Now this week we take a look at conflict on the African continent. We examine the underlying issues and the way forward. We're happy to host Ambassador Dr. Martin Kimani, who's Kenya's permanent representative to UN and a specialist in war, conflict and counter-terrorism. Also, you get to have your say on the issues, and we have Africa's top 10. You're watching the Africa Leadership Dialogues. I'm Julie Gichuru. Ambassador Martin Kimani is Kenya's permanent representative to UN. Prior to this, he was Deputy Director of the Ansari Africa Center at the Atlantic Council, a non-partisan think tank based in Washington, D.C. that focuses on leadership and international affairs. He's also an Associate Fellow at the Conflict, Security and Development Group at King's College London and has been working on a book on religious belief and genocide in Rwanda. Dr. Kimani was also a director at CWARN, the Conflict Early Warning and Response Mechanism under the auspices of IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. Let's take a look at his insights on Africa. Ambassador Martin Kimani, welcome to the Africa Leadership Dialogues. It's a pleasure to have you on the show, and your profile, your history and your professional experience in studies of war, in counter-terrorism on the continent and so much more. It's really exemplary. And so we come to you with the issue of conflict in Africa. And there's a lot of concern right now looking at emerging conflicts and reignited conflicts in many parts of the continent, that this African rising narrative was far too early, that we are still in, major problems. But let me ask you, where do you think the continent is right now?
Well, first of all, how are you,
I'm
Julie?
well,
thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here, and I think your question cuts really to the heart of how we are to think about ourselves as a continent right now. Now, I happen to think that there is certainly a series of conflicts that are ongoing, violent conflicts across the Sahel. We've seen what's happening in South Sudan. Somalia remains unsettled with insurgencies and terrorists operating there. And we see a series of what you would call at least political crises on the continent. However, I take these to not be extraordinary eruptions, but instead to be symptoms of first political volatility. And this is a political volatility that you would expect for a continent that is essentially still working out its political institutions and its political cultures. So we're experiencing the volatility that I associate first with the state building process and the very, very competitive and opposed politics that follow whenever you're trying to actually bring about institutional change. Africa is not a business. It's a continent of almost 1 billion people, all who have such varied interests, such varied perceptions of what should happen with different political ideas and different interests. So trying to forge nations out of this is inevitably a volatile situation. So peace, of course, is sought, but what I think the future is going to be is a rising Africa with occasional countries that slide backwards into conflict, and then have to recover, so that the issue becomes not merely the weakness, the individual wars that are happening, but the response to those wars. And what I'm seeing is increasingly African countries and regions taking up the issue in terms of seeking solutions.
Right. When you speak about this, it sounds so academic, but you've been in the heart of rescuing people who are in danger, bringing people out of conflict areas. You're in the process of actually trying to find solutions when it comes to bringing the warring parties together. We're going to talk a bit about that for a moment, because can you remove yourself and think academically when you're actually in the thick of things? That's going to be interesting to find out. But before we do that, let's just look at the whole issue of leadership, which comes, of course, under fire in situations like this. You look at a conflict situation, you look at the leadership and you ask, what are we thinking, taking a country backward? But there's the other aspect of it. It's the person who picks up the weapon and chops up his neighbor or somebody from the next community. What does it say about us? What do we take from this as Africans?
Well, I think we take that great tragedies are happening amongst us. We take that great wrongs are being committed amongst us. We take it that we should be outraged and we should be unhappy about what's happening. And no one should sugarcoat it, because the reality is that Africans do suffer from forms of violence and persecution by their fellow Africans. What we should not do is take ourselves to be perverse or abnormal. There is nothing that is happening in Africa that is not the norm and highly common historically around the world and occurring in other parts of the world. That is to say, conflict and violence has always attended the attempt to build singular nations and to build nation states. The rise of the state, those sets of institutions that we keep talking about, has very rarely happened peacefully. It's happened as a matter of negotiation, and that negotiation has a lot of times been violent. So we can see violence as, once you get beyond the humanitarian aspect of it, once you get beyond the sadness and the tragedy of it, violence is a form of negotiation. Violence is an extension of political dialogue and political competition. It shouldn't be, but where institutions are weak, where the political culture is yet to be formed with a strong enough center, then violence becomes one of the ways people negotiate their differences.
What a powerful statement that is. It brings me straight to the question on institutions. African institutions, we've been talking, and right here on Africa Leadership Dialogues, we're big on African solutions to African problems, but are our institutions doing enough? I'm talking about the AU, I'm talking about IGAD. What's been going on, and other bodies? Are we doing enough?
Yeah. Well, I've had the honor of working for IGAD, and I'll tell you that IGAD is two things. It's a very small organization with a very big job. If you went to the headquarters in tiny little Djibouti and saw this small building full of people who work extremely late nights, always looking for money, always short of resources. And then there they are, they're supposed to do something about Somalia and Al-Shabaab. They're supposed to do things about climate change. They're supposed to do things about disaster. They're supposed to do things about droughts and other emergencies. And if you went then, let's say, to Brussels, to the headquarters of the EU, how many wars are they dealing with? It's a massive building awash with money, with thousands and thousands of people. And so IGAD I'm just taking it as an example. Mm-hmm. Somebody can look at IGAD and say, what are they doing? But you'd be amazed at how much they do with so little. You'd also be amazed at the depth of perspective and experience that IGAD represents in this region. When there's a problem and IGAD gathers people around to try and deal with that problem, I've met some of the wisest, most experienced people I've ever met. And I've worked all over the world. And I will tell you, I am never in as great awe as I am when I'm in those processes that are dealing with peace on the ground, that are in small negotiating rooms where parties are arguing furiously with each other. And then people go out to give a press conference and it sounds so mild what they're saying. It's not because what was being done in the background was mild or uncaring. It's because the politics of the situation dictates it. It's because the sensitivity and the experience of the people negotiating the situation dictate it. The AU has very much been present. There's no meeting I've been to in South Sudan where the AU representation and AU perspective has not been forcefully articulated. But the AU has sat slightly back so that it can support IGAD, because it's IGAD that understands what's happening here right now.
So let's go into this a little bit further and tell us, Martin, are there success stories we haven't heard of? And, the concern right now, I think, is around the fact that Rwanda happened in a month and the world stopped and said, oh my goodness, where were we when this was going on? We just didn't realize the scope and the depth of this problem. Could we be sitting in Africa on another time bomb like that without realizing?
There are success stories. South Sudan itself was a success story. 2 years ago we were all celebrating.
Can it be success if, conflict is reignited so quickly? Does that not mean that there remain some serious underlying issues that were not perhaps ironed out?
Oh yes, definitely. There were things that were not ironed out. But because of the scale of events, because of the scale of countries and the scale of history, we're not talking about success being judged a year in, a year out. So we celebrated for 2 years. We said there was a peaceful changeover of government, there was a peaceful separation of these countries where one felt that it wanted to go its way from the other after years of war. We celebrated. But while we were celebrating, everyone, from the people themselves in South Sudan, the leadership there, and the other countries that had been responsible for supporting them to get to that independent moment, everyone dropped the ball. No one was as attentive to the deep underlying issues as they should have been. But this is playing hindsight. It's very easy to do. Now, is the South Sudan experiment over? I don't think so. We have a terrible crisis that has shown what it means not to deal with those deep underlying political problems. I actually think South Sudanese people are so tired of war that this is going to be the motivator to try and get deeper into what they need to get into. But that doesn't mean it's not going to stay bad for a little bit of time. In terms of success stories, almost every independent African country is a success story. You have to begin that way, because every African country represents the success at seeking and attaining freedom. So every African country we see today starts off as a success. That success then gets disappointed because of the newness of the country, because of the expectations, the global games, the failures of leadership. And then what do African people do? African people then continue struggling.
Are we resilient, or do we not learn from our mistakes? I'm not sure which it is. Maybe you can share your thoughts with us as well on the social media platforms. I want to go into underlying issues. Just looking at inequity. Is this what it's all about? Is it all about people saying, I want the same chances, I want a better future? Or is there much more going on?
Yeah. Well, Julie, the pace of change is tremendously fast today. Your show, when I was growing up, even having a TV was like for rich people. Today, a lot of people can afford TVs. Having a phone, a mobile phone. All these technologies and all this information has come into our lives, and it's dramatically changed what we expect from our lives. People want to do better, faster. So the level of expectation on this continent is massive. That level of expectation is both a promise and a threat. It's a promise because if it's harnessed, it means we get prosperous. If it's not harnessed, or it's harnessed by the wrong people, it means you get conflict.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
Looking at the geopolitics now around, because this is a problem that affects not just Africa, many other parts of the world. And you've been part of a major council, advisory council in the US, looking into these matters, particularly of security on the African continent. So let me ask you this. Why is it, when it comes to nations like Zimbabwe and Kenya, the world cares? it matters, and they'll roll in here and do everything they can to contain the situation. But when it comes to South Sudan, it's not quite as important. Rwanda was ignored, and even that 1 month, those 28 days were an utter disaster for the country. Well, explain this to Africans. Well, what is all this about? Why are some nations more important than others?
Well, I could explain it quite easily this way, and I don't want to sound unkind. But Africans should understand that they have only themselves to depend on. Sometimes they have friends, but those friends are never permanent. And so Africans need to have to absorb this idea that the very way that they won their independence is the very way that they're going to build their countries. Now, this is not to say that Africans should be opposed to powerful countries globally. No. It's to say this idea that there's somebody who owns your problems, somebody who cares with you, with your problems, is false. And in fact, the other thing Africans should know is that your problem is the single greatest asset you have. It's from your problem that you create a nation. This thing happening in South Sudan today, if the largest, most powerful countries came and told South Sudan, listen guys, why don't you just relax? Let's take care of this for you, right? Let's put the agreements for you. Let's set up the ministries for you. Let's get the water flowing for you. The South Sudanese should tell them, go away, please. The South Sudanese should just say, please, we just want help for us to be able to sit down on our own together. We just want help so that we can build our country. Your problem is your opportunity. And Africa's problems, the reason why Africa is rising is because there are no railroads. That's a problem, right?
And it is the opportunity.
But that's the opportunity. And so we need to own our problems and stop being so down on ourselves. You know, that feeling of self-pity, which we're very given to, it's an utterly useless feeling. It doesn't help you build anything. And so the people of South Sudan, when I've been there very frequently over the last month, these are some of the most magnificent people on this continent. If you just look at them, they are so tall, they're so regal. They have fought so ferociously to be where they are today for a very long time. If you look at the caliber of leadership, Dr. John Garang, I named my son Garang.
Wow.
In
honor of him?
In honor of him. If you read his speeches, he's a global figure. He's a Lincoln figure. He's a Mandela figure without all the movies made about him. So I'm not trying to sort of give a softy good message, but I'm saying seriously, let's take what's wrong. Let's get deeper into understanding its systemic nature.
A lot of people right now very worried about the future for Africa and saying, you see, we said Africa rising far too early. As I mentioned earlier on this show, people are they're now becoming skeptics. They're pessimistic. They're saying, what's wrong with us as Africans? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the continent?
I'm very optimistic. The other day when I called up a group of young technology people at IHAP in Nairobi, a lady called Juliana Rotich and of Ushahidi.
Yes.
And I said, listen, Juliana, where are you? She said, I'm at my grandmother's house. I'm in our rural area in Kitale. I said, look, I know it's Christmas Day, but we don't know what to do. We need somehow Kenyans who are in South Sudan to be able to SMS us and for us to be able to see where they are on the map. She dropped everything she was doing. She called me back an hour later and she told me, I have 7 volunteers. They've stopped what they were doing. They've stopped their Christmas plans. And 3 hours later, they had a system up and running. And all a Kenyan needed to do, we couldn't get it free at the time, was just pick up your mobile somewhere in the bush in South Sudan and just SMS his Kenyan number. And out you popped on a map at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Then we had and then we had other volunteers manning a 24-hour help desk at the ministry. So how can I be pessimistic when I see that?
That in itself is a very powerful message that I think will resonate with me, and I hope with many of the viewers today, that in our problems lie our greatest opportunities if we can just find our solutions, the ones, the way forward for our countries. So earlier, I talked about the fact that, you've studied a lot of this. So you have an academic response that, clearly is well informed. But now you've been in the thick of things for quite a while now. Is there a difference? And how does it feel, for instance, trying to get sleep at night, knowing that these peace talks are ongoing, there's still conflict, lives are being lost, you're evacuating people to safety. What's it like being in the thick of things?
Being in the thick of things has allowed me to see leadership in action. I've seen President Uhuru, and I've seen our Cabinet Secretary, Ambassador Amina, working 12, 14, 15-hour days on these issues. I was with our Cabinet Secretary in South Sudan, in Juba, and then in Addis over the holidays. To be in Juba at the airport and watch a Kenya Defense Forces plane land with food, not only for Kenyans in Juba, but for South Sudanese people in Juba. Why was that sent? It was sent merely because we said, you know what, we cannot sit here and say that the world out there should feed people. We're not rich, but hey, we can afford a few tons of food. I know that was one of the proudest moments of my life. So being in the thick of it has shown me that Kenya is evolving in terms of leadership to a very powerful place, first of thinking about Kenyans constitutionally. And I think that's a reflection of the Constitution, actually. That you can't just, Kenyans are not a side thought or a second thought. They're right present. They're present. And so if you'd seen our embassy in Juba doing that, then you would see that we are evolving towards a place where our systems are increasingly reactive to Kenyans. Now, that means we're a work in progress. And that, to me, is the entire promise of this next few years.
Right. We've practically run out of time. And, at the end, what matters is each individual's responsibility in making that narrative come to pass, making Africa rise. Each of us has a role to play wherever we might be. So I want to ask you to help us close the show by looking into the camera and giving and giving your message to Africa, and in particular, your message to African leaders and your message to the African citizenry.
First, we as Africans must realize that at the basis, at the root of our problems is a crippling lack of self-confidence. And that lack of self-confidence comes from the idea that to improve and to develop is to become someone that you are not. And so Africans should realize that modernization and development is not westernization, that there are forms of modernization and development that can be grown here, that have been grown here, and that you can look to. 2, own your problems. Let us own our problems. No one else owns them. They are ours to hold close to our chest, because that's where our solutions are going to come from. 3, to our leaders. Our leaders are in the middle of a historical period in which the rate of change is unprecedented. Governing is like riding a lion. So our leaders must be aware, first, of better systems thinking, go deeper into first principles of what principles, social and cultural principles are they using to think about their societies. 3, our leaders must be relentlessly focused on independence. We cannot be begging for money and expecting that is what's going to solve our problems. We have to generate resources ourselves, or we have to live according to the means that we have. And to young Africans, The future is yours, but you have to seize it, and you have to understand that for you to have it the way you expect it, you need to be extraordinary. You cannot just be ordinary, because the way the world is set up, Africans are not supposed to thrive. We're just supposed to watch as the world thrives, as the world gets rich, while we see our products all over the world creating that wealth. So understand that to create a world system in which you thrive means you being a fighter and being confident in yourself.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Martin Kimani. The message is clear. To young people, the future is yours, but as Africans, you must be extraordinary to grab that future. Asante.
Thank you.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
I'm Ambassador Martin Kimani, and you're watching the African Leadership Dialogues.
What a powerful interview. Do continue to share your thoughts on conflict in Africa. We'd love to hear from you. Let's take a look at some of the views that are already coming in.
This week we asked you, what are the underlying causes of conflict in Africa and how can we address them? Victor Mulovi says, some of the conflicts in Africa are caused by Western countries using rebels to loot their minerals. You will find that most African countries where there are minerals, there is conflict. Gesuka Leonard says, scramble for resources and the unending power struggles that are ethnically instigated. The solution to this is by getting our act together and better leadership. We always get leaders we deserve.
My name is Anthony Taiti Washira from Nairobi, and I think conflict in Africa is mainly caused by hunger for power, whereby some people will go to any length to assume power, even if it means going to war. Also, the other thing that causes conflict in Africa is this demon called ethnicity, whereby some Africans believe that some communities are more superior to the others. So whenever there is any political posting given to a certain community, there is always suspicion, and you'll find them protesting and even going to war. The solution to all this, number one, I think leaders in Africa need to embrace democracy and promote it by respecting the people's choice, that is in an election. Also, as Africans, we need to realize that ethnicity has no place in our midst.
To join our conversation, go to our G+ page, Africa Leadership Dialogues. On Facebook, Africa Leadership Dialogues. On Twitter, @AfricaLD. And on WhatsApp, send your video comments to +254 715 816 033.
Thank you for sharing your views. It's through robust discussion and dialogue that this continent will move forward. Now, time for Africa's Top 10.
On Africa's Top 10 this week, we focus on the African Union objectives. Starting us off at number 10 is promoting sustainable development at the economic, social and cultural levels, as well as integration of African economies. Coming in at number 9 is establishing the necessary conditions that will enable the continent to play its rightful role in the global economy and in international negotiations. At position 8 is promoting and protecting human rights in accordance with the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and other relevant human rights instruments. Slotted in at number 7 is promoting democratic principles and institutions, popular participation and good governance. Promoting peace, security and stability on the continent comes in at number 6. Positioned at number 5 is encouraging international cooperation, taking due account of the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At number 4 is promoting and defending Africa's common positions on issues of interest to the continent and its people. Taking the number 3 spot is accelerating the political and social economic integration of the continent. Coming in at number 2 is defending the sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence of its member states. And at number 1 this week is achieving greater unity and solidarity between the African countries and the people of Africa. And that's Africa's Top 10 this week.
Well, we've come to the close of the show and we leave you this week with a quote from John Garang de Mabior. He was, of course, the South Sudanese politician, leader and president until his death in 2005. And he said, "If you get knowledge, you can't keep your knowledge away from people seeking help. These are our people." So how can each of us play a role in ensuring we are getting knowledge across? We are sharing information, perspectives and views with a view to building a stronger and certainly a peaceful Africa. I leave you with that question. Blessings to you and blessings to Africa.